sunshine on my mind. We're burning through the city of lights. You're the sunshine on my mind. We're burning through the city of lights.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this wonderful call. Today, we have a fantastic topic to discuss, climate impact and decision-making and uncertainty. My name is Samuel Abisinguza. I'll be your host. And with us, we have our special guests, Stan Pinsent and Johannes. And we'll be discussing about climate impact. And as you may have observed over the recent years, in recent years, global climate policy has shifted from unprecedented momentum to widespread political backlash. This session examines how Founders Pledge is responding through Climate Fund, pivoting from targeted interventions to system-level defense across global regions. In this session, we will see how decision-making under uncertainty can be systematic, improving grant decisions, and revealing which uncertainties matter most for future research. On this call, we are lucky to have Johannes, who is a climate lead at Founders Pledge. His research and grant making have been featured on Vox, Volts, Prospect Magazine, Giving What We Can, 80,000 Hours, Washington Post, and New York Times, as well as Future of Life Institute. He previously worked at a think tank advising climate policy decision makers. He holds a master's in social sciences from the University of Chicago, and he also holds a master's in sociology with a focus on research methods. And we also have Stan Pinsent, who is an applied researcher at Founders Pledge. He is co-developing a quantitative impact model to compare high-impact funding opportunities in climate. He previously worked on the global health at SEARCH, spelled as CEARCH. He has taught maths and hosted an education podcast. He also holds a degree in mathematics from the University of Oxford. But one other interesting thing of his resume is also very great and creative in the kitchen. He can cook and experiment. So I am excited about this talk. Anyway, just for housekeeping before we dive in, just a reminder, if you have any questions for the speakers, you can submit them via Swapcard. And I'll be selecting a mix of your questions and a few prepared questions. Well, great to have you both here. Please join me to welcome Johannes to the stage as we dive in.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sam. And well, thank you everyone for who's attending from wherever you are in the world. Yeah, and today we're going to talk about climate impact and decision-making under uncertainty, or less technically, how to make good decisions when shit has hit the fan and everything is uncertain. We really try to take you into how we think about grant making and research methodology in this moment. Next slide. And really, we're going to cover a lot of ground, but I really want to anchor two key ideas in the beginning. So the first idea, and sorry for swearing here, but the first idea really is that shit has hit the fan, by which we mean that climate policy right now is in the most challenging environment than it has been for over a decade, I think is fair to say. This is a global phenomenon, right? I think we all know about the American situation, but it's not really only in the United States, it's really in the whole world. In Europe, climate policy is under massive threat, internationally speaking. I think the recent COP has been a massive disappointment again, right? So we're in a situation where climate policy is under threat and lots of negative things are happening. And yeah, frankly, we've been warning on this for a while, but this is kind of one of the key ideas, and that creates a lot of political and other uncertainty. So that's key idea number one. Next slide, please. And the key idea number two that kind of come up again and again that is related to this, but is also kind of separate and kind of has really deep methodological implications that Stan will kind of cover, is that everything is uncertain all the time and all at once, right? So, and this kind of means that, yeah, we need to make decisions given that everything's extremely uncertain, given that, given that we're not really in a situation where we can do RCTs, like can collect strong evidence, but we're kind of in a situation where everything is kind of deeply uncertain, but this is kind of we still need to make decisions, and we want to make the most impact oriented or the most impact maximizing decisions, but we kind of need to deal with that situation. Okay, next slide. So this is kind of what we're going to cover. So I'm going to kind of start with a little bit of a recap that kind of goes a bit deeper into the point that I was kind of making right now. So why it's really crucial to tackle risk and uncertainty when you're thinking about effective giving and climate, and also kind of what does it actually mean to think about effective giving and climate? How does EA thinking apply to climate? Then we're going to talk about our main methodological answer to this question, and Stan's going to talk you through the impact model and also kind of walk you through an example that kind of illustrates how we're kind of using this in practice for real decision making on the ground. Then I'm going to take it back to kind of our grant making this year, what we're prioritizing, and gonna conclude. Okay, next slide. Yeah, and yeah, first the recap, why tackling risk and uncertainty is really crucial. So the first thing I would kind of say is that effective giving and climate cannot avoid uncertainty, right? So I've already talked a lot about uncertainty, about the political uncertainties, and one might say, okay, let's just ignore it, let's just plant trees, or let's kind of find something that's like malaria, and that's kind of something that's very certain in climate. But from our perspective, this is really not something you can do. So I kind of recently put it like this. It's much better to probably have a large impact to almost certainly have very little impact, and you really shouldn't optimize for certainty when you're kind of thinking about effective giving in climate. Why is that so? There's basically three reasons for this. The first reason, I think, if you kind of look at climate from an effective altruist lens, I think you kind of start from this idea that finding really cost-effective opportunities is relatively difficult if a field is very crowded, right? If something is not neglected. And climate, compared to everything else that effective altruists care about, is clearly not neglected, right? It's a very crowded field. So kind of society spends something like 2 trillion on this. Climate philanthropy is about 15 billion. So this is very large. And this really should let us expect that there are kind of few obvious low-hanging fruits, right? So that there are few kind of very certain actions that we can take that are highly, highly effective given how many resources are already being spent. So this is kind of the prior, right? The first intuition one might have. But there's also a lot of evidence that kind of confirms this in the case of climate. The first kind of line of evidence that I want to highlight is really on the evidence from carbon offsets. Carbon offsets is kind of the idea, how can you really, essentially, how can you buy emission reductions or emission avoidance in a way that's highly certain, right? That is the goal that carbon offsets have, right? That is kind of the value proposition of carbon offsets. But the literature is actually very clear that this doesn't work. So carbon offsets are either not cost effective, very expensive, right? Or they don't work at all, or they're both, right? So that's kind of, I think, pretty clear. So this is kind of evidence for the fact that it's kind of really hard to find something that's kind of good in the way that malaria nets are a good intervention in global health. That it's kind of difficult to find something equivalent in climate. So that's kind of one piece of evidence. I think another piece of evidence is really that if you think about why you would be more optimistic in climate today than, say, 15 years ago, if you kind of trace what has happened, where we've been successful, all of the things that have really moved the needle on climate have been decadal, indirect, and very uncertain bets playing out well, right? So like technological change is really crucial to addressing emissions. So if you kind of go back to how has solar become cheap, how has wind become cheap, electric cars, all of these things have traveled through policy advocacy for technological change in many different world regions. So these are inherently indirect theories of change. And if you kind of want to make stuff like this more likely philanthropically, you're kind of inheriting the uncertainty of the theory of change that you're trying to trigger, right? So you have to deal with this uncertainty. Next slide. And yeah, so this is kind of a stylized version to represent this. So essentially, what we're claiming is that everything on climate philanthropy that's worth doing, right? So everything that's kind of has a plausibility of being the most impactful thing that you can do is kind of very uncertain in the best of times. And the reason for that is because you're having a multi-step theory of change, right? So first, kind of you're trying to fill a funding gap, and already there you're having uncertainty about additionality. Then you're usually doing what you're funding is actually something that's kind of indirect in some sense, right? So some form of advocacy in the broadest sense, which might lead to policy change. Whether or not it leads to policy change is uncertain. What a given policy does is uncertain. How the domestic effects of a given policy translate into global effects is uncertain. So there's kind of like 4 or 5 different layers of uncertainty that kind of have to be taken into account and that are kind of compounding. And this leads to a situation where you always have extremely high uncertainty about almost everything that you can kind of fund in climate philanthropy. We gave a whole talk about this 2 years ago. We just linked this here. I'm not gonna repeat this, but this is kind of the basic idea. Next slide, please. And of course, we're probably not living in the best of times, right? I don't want to say we're kind of living in the worst of times, but we're certainly living in particularly volatile times, right? So in times where things are generally more uncertain, moving more quickly. You can see this here on this graph, kind of one evidence of this is kind of, okay, this is economic uncertainty. Economic policy uncertainty measured, right? So you can kind of clearly see this went up in COVID, but also can clearly kind of see it went up in 2025. Obviously, so this is related to tariff policy changes like that. So 2025 is certainly extreme, and this indicator might be more extreme than more political indicators. But I think the basic idea that we're living in times where things are more uncertain, I think is kind of probably clear, and I think kind of an idea that probably most of us would agree with. So that's kind of an important part. And there's really 2 different aspects that are particularly important for this, for climate. So one is really lots of geopolitical and geoeconomic changes, right? So there's a lot of uncertainty around trade policy, multilateralism, kind of moving to a new world order, moving away from globalized and multilateral cooperation to something much more divided. So uncertainties around that. And then more specifically to climate really is under threat essentially everywhere in the world, right? So, I mean, we can see this in the United States very obviously, but we can also see this in Europe, where it's kind of right now unclear, where climate policy could also kind of really fall over the next 2 or 3 years. And this is kind of a new situation. This is kind of quite different from how the situation was 4 or 5 years ago. It's also different from different ways the future could have gone, right? So we also could be in a way a much more stable climate policy situation, say at Harris won the 2024 election. So this is kind of the situation that we're in. Next slide. Yeah, and just to kind of summarize this, or kind of what this means is like, right, first, as you kind of see, okay, under normal circumstances, everything is kind of like a political, like theories of change in climate are always kind of quite uncertain because you have compounding uncertainties over a fairly indirect theory of change. And this is kind of exacerbated by lots of different additional uncertainties that kind of come into play when you're kind of in a situation of political backlash and political threat. So this is kind of the situation that we're facing, a very challenging situation, both in terms of the situation itself, right, for climate action, but also a challenging situation if you're interested in how to make good decisions and how to kind of realize the promise of effective giving or effective altruism, which is like, how do we make evidence-based decisions that are kind of impact maximizing. And to kind of talk us through how we try to do this, I'm going to hand it over to Stan, who's our methodology czar, who's kind of developing an impact model, and he's going to take over now.
Thank you very much, Johannes. Yep, I'm Stan, and my job is really
provide
on
a
the
picture
quantitative
of
side
what's
of what we
this
do
whole
in the
effective
climate
altruism
team,
thing about. I
trying
think this
to
will
understand how
primarily
to
be useful to
optimize
people
our
who are
climate
pretty
grant
new
making.
to the
And
effective
I'll be
altruism
focusing
space.
on the
But there might
methodology
be
that we use and how we use it to address all the problems that Johannes just set up. So, as he's explained, we're facing lots of different kinds of uncertainties with our grant making, and we're trying to compare things which are really, really different structurally, so different theories of change. We also need to be able to respond to the
Thank
world when the
you.
world changes.
So
And
I'm going to
we're looking
provide a
to not
picture
just
of
understand
what's this
grants
whole
one by
effective
one,
altruism
but
thing
to
about. I
optimize a
think this
whole
will primarily
portfolio of
be
grant making as we go. So Our approach here is to retain full uncertainty in the modeling, to try and understand the shared structure that's going on in the uncertainty, and to be able to compare not just all the grants we could make, but all the different portfolios of grants that we could make. So on a basic level, what we're doing is what's called a Monte Carlo simulation. You may have heard of cost effectiveness analysis, where you try to estimate the cost effectiveness of a grant. We're essentially doing that, but we're doing it with uncertainty. And we basically repeat the calculation many times, and each time we sample the variables or the inputs from random distributions. And in this way, we can kind of model the outcomes as a distribution. We retain the uncertainty in all of the variables in our model. Now on the screen, I've got a really simple example where we're comparing two organizations, and each organization has 4 characteristics. And maybe in a really simple version, we might multiply these variables together to estimate the cost effectiveness of these 2 possible grants. Now, this example kind of illustrates why we might want to model shared uncertainty. In the example, both of these grants leverage advocacy, and they both use innovation. And we can see that clearly the uncertainty we have about the efficacy of advocacy and of innovation is shared by both grants. So the uncertainty we have about advocacy and innovation isn't helping us decide between them. We've essentially got a big simplification there, and we can make comparative statements between these 2 grants based on what's different about them, which in this case is the technology and the region that they act on. Now, the reason this is really good is it means even if we've got a lot of uncertainty going into the model, because we've got the structure, we only need to worry about the uncertainty that distinguishes the grants that we're interested in making. And even though we are usually highly uncertain about how cost effective each grant will be, we can often make quite confident comparative judgments. We can basically be, say, 90% sure that one grant is more promising than another. We're also, like I said, modeling portfolios of grants, not just individual grants. So this is what we see when we run the model, or a simplified version. The numbers on the right there, 037, they're grant allocations. So how many dollars or millions of dollars are going into each grant option. And what our model does is it basically compares the cost effectiveness of every possible portfolio in every simulation, and it can find the optimal portfolio in every simulation. So we can see in this screenshot, for example, that the top portfolio is the best portfolio 37% of the time. And this is useful because there isn't like a perfect grant portfolio that's always the best. But what we're looking for is a way of doing our grant making which is robust to the risks that we're facing, or robust to the uncertainties about the world and how the future is going to go. So the impact model that we run, it does these 3 things: estimates the cost effectiveness of the possible grants with a Monte Carlo simulation. It models the cost effectiveness of the different portfolios, so different combinations of grants, so we can understand which strategies look strongest based on the inputs of the model. And we also do something called sensitivity analysis, which helps us understand which uncertainties might change our mind, which uncertainties are decision relevant. And that's really important for our research strategy, basically deciding which uncertainties we should work on reducing. And from the examples we've used, it maybe isn't clear why we need such powerful tools. Obviously, in reality, we're not comparing 2 or 3 different grants we could make. We might be considering at any given time dozens of different grants, which could obviously be combined in hundreds or thousands of different portfolios. And so because we have these powerful, very flexible tools, we're able to basically check the full spectrum of options and understand which strategies are going to perform the best. So to illustrate our methodology and maybe why it is the way it is, we're going to zoom in on one of the questions or one of the problems we've been trying to solve in the past year, which is how to balance our grant portfolio globally. So how to diversify our portfolio with different regions to make sure that we're robust to different risks and things that could happen. The main risk, or the main thing that Johannes has talked about really, has been what's happening in the US. So we've, in recent years been thinking the US is extremely important for decarbonization. You can see in the chart there that during the Biden years, the amount of money this is going to science and innovation programs in the Department of Energy skyrocketed. And what we've seen in the past year with the Trump administration is attacks on government capacity, so staff cuts in Department of Energy and other departments. We've seen cancellations of funding that had previously been awarded and reductions in funding. And we've seen policies and executive actions that are particularly targeting renewables and making it harder to build specifically wind and sometimes solar projects. But we don't really know how far to go with this because it's clear that still the US is extremely important. And you can see this from the chart, which comes from a report that we commissioned from EFI, that actually, although a lot has been cut, what's at stake is still much more than what was there before the Biden years. So clearly the US, as it stands right now, is still extremely important for the global decarbonization effort. So we're trying to understand how to calibrate our response to this and how much and whether to diversify some of our US grant making away from the US. And a key part of that question is not just what's just happened, but it's also what will happen next. By no means are we confident that Trump is finished and that the attacks on US climate capacity are over. Clearly, there could be more cancellations, there could be more staff reductions and so on. But we have to be realistic. This can be framed as part of a global kind of rolling back of climate ambition around the world. So maybe in Europe, although it's facing different challenges, we might see similarly threats to climate policy, which would mean that Europe and the EU may not be good hedges against the risks that we face in the US. So just to quickly zoom around some important regions and see what's going on in this question. We've talked about the US. We've seen cuts to government capacity, and there's a risk that things could get worse. In the EU, we also have threats to climate ambition. There's lots of elections coming up in 2027. There's a narrative from the populist right that's trying to undermine climate policy. There's basically a lot of risks, part of the same populist wave of what's happened in the US, but not directly related to whatever Donald Trump does next. And in China, which has become a clean tech superpower for very different motivations, perhaps than Europe and the US, we might actually see it step up somewhat into this leadership void that the US has left behind. So we may see what we call negative correlation. Basically, the worse things get in the US, we might see China becoming actually more important. So this gives us a series of research questions that we could dive into to try and understand. How much has the US importance fallen? How much more will it fall? What's happening in the EU? What's happening in China? And with our model, of course, we don't need to have a final answer on these questions. We can put in our best guess. We can put in our uncertainty interval to try and understand. Now, we think, based on what's happened in the past year or so, that about 10 to 30% of US innovation potential has been eroded. And we think that there's a risk, we expect maybe 15 or 45 percentage points further reduction in expectation. We talked about separate independent risks in the EU, which are somewhat smaller. And then this negative correlation with China, where it actually may become more crucial, more important, the less important that the US becomes. And we can put this together to try and estimate how we should update our best guess of the importance of these world regions. But I think what's really critical and really useful about our methodology is that we're not just relying on these averages or these sort of overall guesses. We can actually model in each simulation the relationships between what happens in the future. We've talked about correlations and shared uncertainty. So we can actually just test which portfolios perform well in all these different simulations and all these different outcomes. So the visualization we have on the screen now is basically showing like the optimal geographic portfolio allocation based on different outcomes for US risk. And we can see that when the risk to the US is really high, which is actually on the left there, that very few resources in optimal portfolios go to the US. And in simulations where the risk is quite low, that means kind of Trump is mostly done with his attacks on US capacity. In those scenarios, actually, US is still a big part or even the majority of optimal portfolio allocation. So not only are we understanding kind of like the average effect, but we can say, okay, well, based on what you believe or what we believe about the state of the world, the risk to the US, this is what a really strong portfolio response would look like. And we can also see this, we can also do this analysis with all other uncertainties and variables to try and understand, well, which ones actually affect portfolio allocation. So overall, we think that the US is still really important, and we're kind of expecting that around 40% of an optimal portfolio would still go to the US, and that's taking into account all the bad stuff that's happened and all the risk from the future. But I think compared to the past, this is somewhat an update away from the US and towards other regions. So to summarize, we've got this methodology for a reason. It's to meet the challenge that we have. We try to capture the structure of all the different grants that we're trying to analyze. And that shared structure means that actually a lot of the complexity gets simplified and we're able to compare grants in a really meaningful way. And we can often be quite confident, even though there's a lot of uncertainty about absolute cost effectiveness, we can often be confident that one grant is more promising than another. We're taking this portfolio approach. So we're not just comparing individual grants, but we're looking at whole strategies, whole portfolios, and finding the ones that are most robust to all the different risks and outcomes that can happen. And because we're capturing the complexity, we're trying to take lots of things into account. We don't just end up hand waving or saying, oh, it's too confusing, it's too uncertain. We can see, well, in actually a majority of outcome simulations, this is what happens, this is the best thing to do. So we can get closer to the optimal portfolio and the best choice. So I'm going to hand back over now to Johannes to explain our grant making strategy now and how we're responding to the climate moment.
Yes, thank you so much, Stan. So yeah, now let's talk about robust to risk, our grant making response, because of course, what we've now talked about is kind of giving us the broad outline, but we really want to take us into action, and we're allocating this year and next year about 100 million kind of based informed by this analysis. So let's kind of look into what we've been doing this year and what we're looking at next. Next slide, please. And the key idea or the key principle that kind of unites everything that Stan was just talking about, or that kind of synthesizes it, is it's also kind of in our report that we just published. It's called Robust to Risk. And the key principle here is robust diversification as the key strategic principle. What does robust diversification mean? Robust diversification means that if you kind of are in a situation where you have a lot of risk, try to not expose yourself to all of the risks that are positively correlated, right? So kind of try to avoid kind of being sensitive or overly sensitive to specific risk kind of turning out negatively. Ideally, what you would want is you would kind of invest in ways that is kind of, you have a lot of negatively correlated risks so that you kind of can protect against all kinds of risks. That's unfortunately the real world, not always possible. But that is kind of the key idea. That is kind of taking what Stan was just talking about, kind of in terms of how this affects global portfolio into real grounds. Let's cover some of those right now. Next slide, please. Yeah. So first, what have we been doing in the US this year, and what are we going to do there next year? Well, we wrote a whole report about our US strategy earlier in the year, which is called All In, which you can find. But broadly speaking, our US work is kind of focused on three different strands. One is kind of building the right of center civil society ecosystem in the United States. We're mostly doing this with building through a strategic field builder, Deploy US. And we've been doing this since 2023 because this is kind of when we first became worried about political risk in the US, because we saw there was so much policy effort now existing, but so little kind of effort spent at protecting. So that's kind of one key lever of our US work, both in terms of risk management, but also kind of taking opportunities. The two other, or the main other kind of focus that we've been focusing on this year in the United States, which has been related to what happened earlier in the year that Bill Gates pulled out of climate philanthropy, is really kind of trying to really invest in the civil society around innovation policy that before Bill Gates had been funding at very high, at higher levels. So kind of trying to step up in reaction to this and really kind of trying to protect this crucial work, given that the US is so important and remains so important for global energy innovation. So that's kind of work where we funded the Innovation Initiative, Clean Tomorrow, also the EFI Foundation, which is doing crucial work on revealing the risk around cutting government capacity, right? So it's kind of about tackling the risks rather than diversifying away from them. So yeah, that's kind of how I would summarize our ES strategy, making the most of this moment, as well as tackling the risks head on. Next slide, please. Okay, another region, and this is probably no surprise, an area where we kind of have been doing grant making for a long time, but are probably going to expand somewhat over next year, is the European Union. So this photo is some EU commissioner for net zero, and Jigar Shah, the former American head of the Loan Programs Office in the United States. So this from an event this week that we funded in Brussels. And yeah, so there in the EU, our approach is really to kind of support European civil society to push for and support ambitious innovation policies. So some of our grantees are mentioned here, right? Because Europe is kind of facing a situation where there is more support for climate policy, but it's also quite fragile, right? So the title of the event was literally to lead or not to lead. So there's a precipice moment in the European context as well. And as Dan already mentioned, there's 2027 elections coming up, and climate policy is under threat on the European level as well. So that's going to be another focus of ours in 2026, is really probably invest against political risk to kind of help stabilize the climate policy effort in the EU. That's Europe. Next slide, please. China and emerging Asia. So yeah, those are 60% of future emissions, right? So this is the big story when it comes to future emissions. And we're roughly having 2 or 3 different strands of work there. One of them is in China is work focused on Tsinghua, or with Tsinghua University, which is kind of focused on coal repowering in the Chinese context. So kind of finding technological solutions to what is the biggest problem for global decarbonization, which is lots of carbon lock-in from new coal capacity in China. And we're kind of supporting work that's kind of focused on replacing the heat source in coal power plants. So this is both for Tsinghua and to quantified carbon. And then we're also doing work with Energy for Growth Hub, but I'm not going to go more into detail here. Next slide. And yeah, we also have some new regions that we're covering that we haven't covered before. So one of them is kind of OECD Asia, so Japan and South Korea, where we're kind of now looking at several grants that will probably kind of increase our grant making in those regions. And one of the key reasons for that is that those regions are kind of less dependent on climate policy. Their energy policy there certainly has always been and has been less driven by climate to begin with. And yeah, there's opportunities there around using the industrial capacity of the Asian tigers and Japan to help with global decarbonization. And obviously here there's 3 dots here. So over the last 2 years, it's always been true that we didn't know a lot of the grants that we would make. So I guess we'll probably also tackle some other regions that we haven't thought about yet. Okay, with that, it's kind of time to conclude. And yeah, really to kind of summarize this long talk, kind of around 3 ideas. Next slide, please. It's really dealing with risk and uncertainty is unavoidable for effective giving in climate, right? So there's really nothing like malaria nets in climate, or there's really nothing, no one has found something in climate that's kind of both extremely certain and kind of reasonably cost effective. That means we need to deal with indirect theories of change. We need to deal with risk, uncertainty. That is kind of critical. And yeah, so that is kind of the key insight that informs our methodology, right? Or what we're kind of prioritizing methodologically. How do we deal with this? We're building methodology that fully takes this into account. So this is what kind of Stan was walking you through, and focused really on building credible comparisons of relative impact, right? We're less interested in does this charity avoid a ton of carbon for 1 cent or 10 euros or $10, sorry. But really more like, can we make sure that we're improving our portfolio choices? Because what ultimately matters is making the right decisions between different options under uncertainty, not narrowing down absolute cost effectiveness. And then the third insight really, so in the current moment, we really believe that we need a globally diversified portfolio, applying this idea of robust diversification, and that's the best way to deal with omnipresent but often independent risks, given that climate damage is non-linear. Sorry, this is a lot, but happy to go into this more later. Next slide. Yeah, some of our 2025 highlights. So yeah, all of this has come up before, but so we've just published our robust risk report, which is kind of a less methodological, kind of more on the ground making contextual explanation of where we see the situation right now, right? So it's kind of describing our grant making and kind of how we see the policy opportunities in different regions. Earlier this year, we published All In, which was focused on the American context under Trump 2. And yeah, you can also find articles on Vox and Washington Post kind of about our current thinking and recommendations. So those are our 2025 highlights. Next slide. You can find all of them and much more on our website, which is foundersbatch.com/climate. And obviously there you can also support our work if you're so inclined. Next slide. That's really everything we wanted to say today. So thank you very much for your attention, and yeah, looking forward to all of your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you for such an insightful presentation, very fascinating ideas. I like what you say that dealing with risk and uncertainty is unavoidable, especially in effective giving. And as we prepare for questions, we have a couple of questions coming from our audience. I just have a quick question to ask. And if you're joining us, please feel free to add your questions on Swapcard. There'll be a chat where you can add your question. But to start off this question session, what factors guide your priorities across different regions? And any of you can dive in and answer this question. But what factors guide your priorities across different regions in the work that you do?
Yeah, so I can tackle this one. So different regions, right? Our North Star is always global decarbonization, and different regions contribute to global decarbonization in different ways, right? So if you're in the US and Europe, which are like small emitters in the future, but like have lots of kind of technological innovation capacity right now. So there we're kind of optimizing for leveraging these innovation systems. To some degree, we're also doing this in China. And then other regions are kind of more characterized by having lots of future emissions, where then the focus is more on bending the emission scenario. That's kind of one answer there. There's also an answer around how we think about risk in different regions, which Dan could go into, but yeah, that is kind of the first answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the main thing I would say in terms of we choose regions, or we choose where to give based on regional strengths. And I guess I touched on risk. So actually, a lot of things are changing in the US right now. So it would be quite naive to assume that the latest data we have from studies from 2023, 2024, or even today are representative of what investments in the US are going to yield. So we need to be aware of what's going to change in the future and how we can build our portfolio to try and be as robust as we can to the risks that we face. But as we saw from my section, it doesn't mean like completely disconnecting from the places that are risky. It just means being clear-eyed about the possible benefits and the risks.
Awesome. Awesome. While we have you, Stan, I see a question from Harrison Bowers. And he said, Monte Carlo seems like a very sensible approach when you're finding at such a large scale. Are you aware of other large effective funders using more advanced maths to model their social returns on investment?
Oh, I wish I had a good answer. I know this has been somewhat controversial in effective altruism, some organizations embracing Monte Carlo simulation, so embracing uncertainty, and others not embracing it. Unfortunately, I couldn't off the top of my head tell you who is and who isn't doing it. But I think, although I do think it's very important to model with uncertainty, I could maybe make the Steelman case for why you wouldn't. And I think it's really important when you're doing grant making and research to have comparability between your estimates. And if you've got a team of more than one, then you need to have a methodology which everyone can use. And I just think Monte Carlo simulation has the extra technical hurdle. It's difficult to maintain a team where everyone knows how to use these tools effectively and in the same way. So that would be my Steelman case for why maybe some teams don't use Monte Carlo simulation. But I certainly think that the benefits outweigh the downsides.
Cool. We have another question from David Wood. He said, are you familiar with the strong recommendation of longtime climate activist Mike Berners-Lee, which is that the best route to a real reversal of our greenhouse gas emission involves societal prioritization of honesty, transparency, and integrity. Hence, society must set higher standards for our politicians, our media, and our businesses. I think, are you familiar with Mike Berners-Lee? Okay,
No, but from what I just heard, so like from what I just heard, what you were just how you were describing him. Sorry, like should we react to the question of whether?
He says, um, so Mike Berners-Lee, he says that the best route to a real reversal of our greenhouse gas emissions involves societal prioritization of honesty, transparency, and integrity. Hence, society
I
must
mean,
set higher standards.
Maybe I can jump in
yeah.
here. Just to try and link it to the themes in our presentation. I think most people would agree we want more integrity and honesty from our politicians, but we shouldn't gamble the global climate strategy on politics being magically fixed. I think what we're contributing here is we're kind of preparing for all scenarios, including what if things don't go well? What if global climate consensus breaks down? What strategies are robust to all the different things that could happen? Johannes.
Yeah, I think, sorry, just like one thing I would kind of add to this, right? So this, like, I mean, the climate backlash that we're seeing is a very democratic climate backlash, right? So it's politicians that are totally doing their job in terms of being representing constituency interests are moving away from climate because publics are moving away from climate. So in that sense, it's not really about like it's difficult for me to think about like how the explanation would go towards more honest politicians when politicians are honestly representing their constituencies, right? So yeah, the problem is not that politicians are less focused on climate than populations are.
Very, very interesting. I would imagine that actually in policy anyway, the public drives what politicians end up driving. So anyway, interesting perspective. We have a question from Anna Carlson. She asked, how do you evaluate the performance of your model and remote broadly your grant making?
I mean, there's the famous phrase about models, right? All models are useful. Sorry, all models are wrong. Some are useful. So I think that's kind of one way of evaluating. Sorry, Stan can kind of add more, but like one way of evaluating this is like, does the model kind of capture the key dimensions, and does it kind of like that we're kind of otherwise would think about qualitatively? And does it kind of help clarify key uncertainties, right? So that's, or does it kind of help us solve problems that we kind of clearly have? So from that perspective, right? So like the key example that Stan was walking through, like how is kind of the model helping us across thinking deeply about how to diversify or how to kind of structure a portfolio across different regions. Like that's something where I think like a model like this is kind of extremely helpful. Then there's other cases where a model like this would kind of hit its limits, right? So like a model is a tool. We also have other tools, right? Like so we're also doing a lot of kind of more contextual work. So yeah, but that's kind of I guess the broad answer. Stan might want to add something, but that's kind of what I'd answer.
Well, yeah, I do want to emphasize that this model is very much still a work in progress, and it's not like we're doing all of our grant making based on the model right now, nor ever probably. But we're getting to the point where we're starting to be able to use our tools to help with strategy, even if it's not totally finished and polished. I would say there's just two main functions of the tool. One is grant making, and the other is research prioritization by telling us which uncertainties are most important. On the second metric, it's clearly helping us because it's pointing to things the uncertainties that we're really unsure about that are changing our decision making. It is difficult to know. It's difficult to like if you're talking about kind of multi-year process of like, oh, did our grants pan out, and what does that say about our model? Um, I think more in terms of like the day to day. Like I'm constantly switching hats between a builder trying to make the model the best it can be, but also kind of like a critic essentially trying to find ways in which the model is getting things wrong and making mistakes.
Cool. We have another question from listeners. But while we get to it, here's a quick one. Which assumption did you previously hold about what drives the biggest climate impact? And what evidence or experience changed your mind?
So I can talk about one example here. So one thing this is really something I think where if you kind of look at our grant making has really moved towards doing a lot more that's focused on system level interventions compared to more targeted, smaller interventions. And this has really been guided by one of the themes of this presentation, which is that if you kind of go back to our early grant making, so we kind of started essentially, the climate fund started in late 2020, which was a great moment for climate action because Biden had just been elected and had a big mandate, and there was an economic crisis, so it was easy to spend money. And it was kind of very promising to do like surgical interventions, targeted interventions, kind of improving how a big climate effort would be spent. And now we kind of really shifted towards a lot of our work's kind of much more focused on system level interventions because the underlying assumption that has changed is that we're now in a situation where the size of the pie, which was kind of always increasing, is kind of much more under threat and much more volatile. So that kind of both makes surgical interventions less good because we cannot rely on there being a big pie in the future, but also kind of increases the importance of kind of shaping the size of the pie, if that makes sense.
Awesome. We just have a few minutes for maybe one more question, and this is a very special question because I think it asks on like how how we can contribute as individuals. It's coming from Shitu. She asks, as someone interested in climate governance, what kind of impact can I realistically make at this stage? And I think this question is more like also like what can I do as an individual to make an impact in the climate?
I mean, obviously you can donate, but that's probably not the answer that she wants to hear. But I think the other thing, if you're having a career and climate governance, I think one thing that's very obvious right now is that we're in a moment for which the climate community and climate policymakers have largely been not prepared. A lot of things are up in the air, and kind of there's a lot of benefit in clearly understanding what the new situation is and kind of adapting as quickly as possible. So I think that would probably my recommendation for someone who kind of wants to work on climate governance would be to like really take a deep dive and analyze where we are right now in the political situation and kind of build a career based on that. And yeah, bringing in kind of that we're really in a different moment than we were 2 years ago, quite different.
Stan, do you have any comments, any additions? How can someone, regardless of where they're at, no matter where they're at in any part of the world, how can they contribute to this important initiative?
Well, I would say sometimes early in your career, the best thing to do is just build career capital for doing things later. But what I'd add to I think what Johannes said is it's probably easier to make headway in the areas where maybe the mainstream climate movement has its blind spots. There are lots of people jostling, I'm just guessing, to be on boats that are going to try and stop oil tankers or things that are kind of like glamorous and like feel really good. Maybe it's much easier to kind of make progress and have impact in the places where there are fewer people queuing up to have a go. Because it maybe doesn't align with this sort of mainstream view. So this could be a lot of things. I mean, I'd recommend reading our recent reports, but Johannes has kind of touched on, it really helps you politics is right of center and you care about the climate because there aren't that many people like you, but there's a lot of things you could do. It could be really pushing for technological innovation, which has a huge role in decarbonization, but isn't typically championed by the mainstream climate movement. And it could be something like nuclear power, which, isn't perfect, no energy source is, but realistically may well be displacing fossil fuels if it's scaled up now. So I'd be looking for areas where perhaps there are fewer people clamoring to have a go, but there's still a huge impact to be had.
Thank you. Thank you, Stan and Johannes. It's been wonderful having you on the call. If you have any closing thoughts, we have 1 minute. Any closing thoughts?
closing thought. Obviously, yeah, feel free to give to the climate fund. That's also any individual, right? The climate fund is open for individuals, but also for the taking action, taking action in the way that kind of sees the world clearly. And that's, I think, also where effective altruists or people that are kind of inspired by effective altruism can add a lot to the climate conversation, because the climate conversation is kind of still dominated by people that I think are not as analytical. So that's an important contribution that people can make with their careers.
Awesome. Stan, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'd always say that I think trying to put numbers on things and trying to estimate is always valuable, even when there's a lot of uncertainty. Not because it will give you the perfect answer, but because it can hopefully get you closer to realizing which uncertainties really matter.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Thank you for joining us. I hope you're enjoying this experience, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you, and goodbye for now.
Thank you, Sam.